At the outset, I would like to thank IIHS for this opportunity to contribute to this very important issue of recovery with dignity. And let me also congratulate the entire research team at IIHS and the University of East Anglia for generating new knowledge and insights on ways to improve and strengthen disaster recovery processes. Based on my experience of working with disaster affected communities in Odisha, in some of the major disasters like the super cyclone of 1999 and the cyclone Philene of 2013, and current engagement on some of these issues at the Asia regional level, I will try and focus on some of the key elements which I consider are important for this conversation, and particularly looking at ways we can support and improve inclusive recovery, not only in India, but South Asia as a region. For disaster recovery policies and practices to be more inclusive, I think some of the critical elements are as follows. The first one is understanding the disaster risk context. Many of our existing disaster management and recovery policies and practices are too much disaster centric, which primarily focuses on the disaster events such as a cyclone, a flood, or a landslide, and doesn't adequately take into account the larger socio-economic, political, and environmental drivers which create and perpetuate vulnerabilities among communities in a given context. So understanding these disaster risk context and identifying the drivers of vulnerabilities, as well as opportunities for building preparedness and adaptive capacities among communities and the systems that govern communities' access to resources and services. Some of the existing policies, such as India's National Disaster Management Plan of 2019 and the Odisha State Disaster Management Plan of 2017, these plans and policies, they recognize the need to shift from the relief-centric approach of the past to a more proactive, holistic, and integrated approach to disaster risk reduction. But the challenge remains with its interface with other key sectoral policies, such as those on rural and urban development, employment generation, social protection, women empowerment, and human rights, to name a few. The second important point I'd like to highlight is on the development disaster climate change nexus. And I think this is very critical when we are talking about climate-induced extreme weather events like cyclones or floods. And most of the time, we also encounter industrial disasters like oil spills and different kind of accidents in many of the industrial sites, which are located along the coast or in some of the most vulnerable regions, but they also provide livelihood opportunities to many communities. So linked to this is the point that there is a need to look at the ways development choices, investments, and resource utilization practices create risks or exacerbate existing vulnerabilities in a given context, and climate impacts such as extreme weather events further erode the development gains and reduces communities' capacities. This nexus understanding, in my opinion, would help look at disaster and disaster recovery as part of a continuum where the sustainability and effectiveness of recovery measures will be largely determined by this interaction. For example, removal of protective mangroves and other coastal vegetation for very lucrative shrimp farming has been identified as an underlying driver of social and environmental vulnerabilities in coastal Odisha. Post-cyclone recovery efforts, which often prioritize housing and infrastructure, which are absolutely critical, should also take into account the needs for rehabilitation and restoration of these damaged ecosystems, which also support livelihoods of thousands of communities and provide natural protection against storm surges. The third point, which I'd like to emphasize related to the first 2 points I made, is the need to shift from the relief-centric approach towards a more rights-based approach. And existing approaches to disaster recovery, which are mostly part of the disaster post-disaster initiatives are mostly relief-centric. This approach looks at disaster-affected communities as homogeneous groups and hence adopts blanket one-size-fits-all recovery packages and plans. Existing inequalities and other factors that disproportionately affect the weaker and marginalized groups in society, and special needs of groups such as the elderly, children, women are often not taken into account. There are instances of post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation plans in India, where some of the most affected and at risk are often left out due to their gender, caste, and other forms of discrimination. Social inclusion has been identified as a key component in India's National Disaster Management Plan, which I referred to earlier. And in my opinion, this could be effectively used to mobilize more rights-based approach to disaster recovery. And given the past history of many disaster and disaster recovery initiatives, particularly in the 3 states where this research looked into, I think some of the key human rights which needs to be considered are the rights to water and sanitation, health, adequate housing, work and livelihood, information and participation, freedom of movement, remedy, to name a few. So this is more important, more from the rights-based perspective to disaster recovery. My 4th point is on the role of civil society in terms of promoting such rights-based approach to disaster recovery. Participation and diversity, as we all know, are key to inclusion, and this is where civil society can play an active role in supporting more inclusive recovery efforts, primarily led by the state. By helping marginalized communities and groups raise their voices and aspirations during recovery processes and facilitating their representation in the decision making, civil society actors can promote inclusive recovery. One example which comes to mind is the Interagency Group, IAG, which is a civil society-led platform which facilitates coordination between different NGOs, humanitarian organizations, and the state government in Odisha. But the need for such collaborative platforms and safe spaces of dialogues and representation is more important at the district and local levels to ensure disaster-affected communities have the opportunity and agency to represent their needs and shape their recovery. So this is more around the role of the civil society. And my 5th point is on the role of the private sector. And I would like to emphasize on the need for more responsible private sector investments and engagement for inclusive recovery. Private sector plays a very critical role, as we all know, in post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation, primarily through supply of materials and other vital supplies in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, and other design and construction of houses, infrastructure such as roads, telecommunications, power, and healthcare. In my opinion, they should not be seen just as mere suppliers of goods and services, but as active agents who can influence the course of disaster recovery through their innovation, resources, and reach. And it is very important for us as a group of practitioners and researchers to look at how private sector can be effectively mobilized as an agent of change in the entire discussion on inclusive disaster recovery. The 6th point is on the need to understand and also look at slow onset disaster. Disaster recovery and the discussions around it are often more focused on rapid onset disasters like cyclones or floods or landslides, and some of the major slow onset hazards like river erosion or drought, which have far-reaching impacts on communities and ecosystems, are often missed because they don't make headline news. So I think this is very important for us to understand that when we're talking about inclusive disaster recovery efforts, it is essential to take into account these slow onset hazards and the disaster they contribute to when taking into account ways many of the communities can effectively participate in disaster recovery and rebuild their livelihoods. So the need to look into slow onset disaster is also critical when you are talking about inclusive disaster recovery. My last and the seventh point, which I'd like to emphasize more from the transboundary regional perspective, which I'm currently engaged in as part of the Oxfam's Transboundary Rivers of South Asia, TRUSA for short, the name of the program, working in transboundary basins, where we also look into the disaster risk in a transboundary context. And for example, if you look into the recent cyclone or some of the past cyclones in the Bay of Bengal region, the origin, the impact, and the scale of the impact are also in neighboring country of Bangladesh. So it is very important that we understand disaster risk and disaster recovery from this cross-border transboundary perspective, and also look at opportunities through which governments, private sector, and civil society can work together across political boundaries to address some of these transboundary disaster risks, and also work together for inclusive disaster recovery efforts. And there are existing mechanisms like the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction and other forums such as BIMSTEC or the South Asia Disaster Management Center, which can facilitate this regional level discussion on disaster risk reduction and inclusive disaster recovery. So with these 7 points, I would like to again emphasize primarily on the need to shift from a relief-centric approach to more rights-based approach, and also looking at the nexus between development, disaster, and climate change to be able to collectively work towards more inclusive disaster recovery efforts at the state level, at the national, and more importantly, also at the regional level. So thank you so much for this opportunity.